Thank you very much. So before I begin, I'd like you all to cast your minds back to about 3 weeks ago. So there was a threat of a second wave of coronavirus in South Australia, and we had just seen what impact that had had on our Victorian neighbours. Fortunately, we only needed a few days, unlike the significant restrictions on movement endured by Victorians for many weeks. But as any budding youth in such novel and unique circumstances, I often ponder, what role might the Constitution play in this? And such was clearly at the forefront of Victorian hotelier Julian Gerner's mind in October of this year. Victoria had been enforcing its lockdown restrictions, preventing all movement of more than 5 kilometres and later 25 kilometres from a resident's premises. Naturally, Mr Gerner wished to travel beyond this radius, but was prohibited by those pesky lockdown directions. Luckily for Mr Gerner, there was a potential saving grace arising, although not explicitly, from the Constitution. The essence of the plaintiff's argument was that a qualified freedom of movement could be implied from, firstly, the text and structure of the Constitution, secondly, the system of representative and responsible government enshrined in the Constitution and as an adjunct to the implied freedom of political communication, and or thirdly, Section 92. For the purposes of this evening, I have focused on the third argument, in particular the development of Section 92 throughout the course of the Convention debates and the near explicit dismissal of such a protection of intrastate movement. The plaintiff's submissions on this point were decidedly brief, effectively inferring from Section 92 that because interstate intercourse required an element of intrastate intercourse, the latter freedom must therefore be protected. To briefly contextualise the eventual wording of Section 92, trade, commerce and intercourse among the states shall be absolutely free, to paraphrase, it is of interest to note that the clause initially read trade, commerce and intercourse throughout the Commonwealth shall be absolutely free. While potentially minor in importance in most cases, in the context of an implied intrastate freedom, the arguments in favour of making this change, as expressed in the Convention debates, are quite illuminating. The Honourable Isaac Isaacs, later Justice Isaacs of the High Court, raised concerns about the phrase throughout the Commonwealth, in contrasting the intention behind Section 92, effectively concerned with border duties and how states interacted with each other across those borders, with the potential broader scope of the phrase posing a risk to the internal management of the states, where intrastate management, by virtue of throughout the Commonwealth encompassing the entire Commonwealth, would effectively be caught by Section 92. Despite some initial dismissive responses suggesting that this dispute was a linguistic non-issue, with support from Chief Justice Griffiths, by the 1898 Melbourne Convention, a majority of members began to share Isaac's view. Dr. John Quick expressed the view that the framers were anxious to provide for absolute freedom between the colonies, but should not be interfering with local regulation. And Mr. Edmund Barton cautioning that throughout the Commonwealth risked being read as encompassing internal trade, commerce and intercourse, an outcome unconnected with interstate relations and therefore beyond the intended scope of Section 92. As such, the framers voted in favour of using the phrase among the states instead. This distinction has been threaded, in spite of a perceived artificiality, through several High Court judgments between 1920, per Chief Justice Knox and Justices Isaacs and Stark in W.A. Macarthur and the State of Queensland, and more recently, 2012, per Justice Kiefel, as she was then known, in Betfair and Racing, New South Wales. There remains a distinct sense that interstate and intrastate trade, commerce and intercourse were specifically distinguished by the framers, and therefore this distinction must be maintained in considering the scope and effect of Section 92. As much seems to have now been further confirmed and approved by Justice Keane in argument. Although there may be circumstances where intrastate trade, commerce or intercourse are appropriately connected to some overarching interstate outcome, as a means of establishing an unrestricted freedom of movement within states, Section 92 does not assist. The plaintiff's other submissions on how the Constitution implied a freedom of movement were similarly unconvincing. A freedom of movement arising from representative and responsible government was deemed aspirational rather than anchored in the Constitution, in the words of Chief Justice Keefe, while attempting to imply the freedom from the text and structure fell into the very trap that Longy suggests you should not do, that is, sit back and say what is required by federation rather than asking particularly what the structure and text of the Constitution shows, in the words of Justice Gordon. After a 4-minute adjournment, the court declined to hear oral submissions from Victoria or any of the interveners. As we eagerly await the published reasons of the court, alas, this evening occurring 24 hours too soon, had South Australia imposed such restrictive directions and we found ourselves unable to travel beyond a particular kilometre radius, we can at least all rest easy knowing that the framers of the Constitution had knowingly decided to leave this power in the hands of the states. Thank you.